Camping alone was something I'd always wanted to try, a way to prove to myself that I could face solitude and nature without fear. It wasn't supposed to be about bravery, just a quiet escape from the hum of daily life. The forest I chose was deep and remote, a patch of wilderness rarely visited. It seemed perfect. I parked my car at the edge of a dirt trail and hiked in for about 3 miles. The path was narrow, winding through towering pines and dense undergrowth. Birds chirped above, and the air smelled of moss and damp earth. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. By the time I found a clearing large enough for my tent, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I pitched my tent quickly, gathered some wood, and started a fire. The crackling flames provided a warm, flickering light as night fell. I had my journal with me and began jotting down notes about the tranquility of the forest, the way the wind rustled the leaves, the distant sound of a stream trickling somewhere nearby. It was around 9 p.m. when I first noticed the silence. The forest had been alive with sound just moments before. Crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Now, it was as if someone had hit a mute button. The silence was absolute. Even the fire seemed quieter, its crackling subdued. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was normal. Maybe the animals had sensed my presence and gone still, but then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. At first, they were faint, distant, as though someone, or something, was walking through the woods. The sound grew louder, closer, and more deliberate. The steps weren't hurried, but slow and deliberate, crunching twigs and dead leaves underfoot. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. The footsteps stopped. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, but I couldn't see anything. Just trees, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms. I waited for several minutes, straining my ears, but the footsteps didn't return. I told myself it was a deer or some other animal. That's what made the most sense. Animals can sound a lot like people walking, especially in the quiet of the forest. Still, I kept my flashlight and a pocket knife close as I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. Sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of fabric or creak of the tent sent a spike of adrenaline through me. Around midnight, I finally started to drift off. That's when the whispers began. They were faint at first, almost like the wind, but as I listened, I realized they weren't natural. They were voices, overlapping and murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting a dim orange light over the clearing. Beyond the glow, the darkness pressed in like a living thing. The whispers seemed to come from every direction, swirling around me in a chorus of low, guttural tones. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trunks and shadows. But then, at the edge of the clearing, I saw it, a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. The light barely touched it before it stepped back, blending into the trees like smoke. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced with possibilities, a trick of the light, my imagination running wild, or maybe some hermit who lived off the grid. But deep down, I knew this wasn't human. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I backed into the tent, fumbling for my phone to call for help. No service. Of course. The tent's fabric rippled, as though something brushed against it from the outside. My entire body tensed. I gripped the pocket knife, my hands shaking, and held my breath. The whispers stopped. Then, from just outside the tent, a voice. "Why are you here?" It wasn't a shout or a growl, but a quiet, almost conversational tone. A voice that sounded eerily human, but with something off, like it was straining to mimic natural speech. I didn't answer. My mind screamed at me to stay silent. The voice came again, this time from the other side of the tent. "You shouldn't have come!" I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my flashlight and knife, I burst out of the tent and spun around, shining the light in every direction. The clearing was empty. The trees stood silent and still. The whispers started again, louder this time, circling me like a swarm. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw them. Figures emerging from the trees, their bodies thin and elongated, their faces featureless. I ran. I didn't care about the tent or my supplies. I sprinted through the woods, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled over roots and rocks. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frenzied, as though the forest itself was alive and angry. Eventually I saw the glint of moonlight reflecting off metal. My car. I practically threw myself into the driver's seat, locking the doors and jamming the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, the tires skidding on the dirt road as I sped away. In my rearview mirror I saw them standing at the tree line, their heads tilted, watching me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main highway. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. When I finally pulled over to catch my breath, I noticed something chilling. Clinging to the outside of my car, smeared across the back window, were long, dark handprints. I've told myself I'll never go camping alone again, but the truth is, I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe in the woods or anywhere else. The whispers still haunt my dreams, and every now and then I catch the faint sound of footsteps when I'm alone. The idea was simple: a weekend alone in the woods. I'd rented a small rustic cabin at the top of Blackthorn Ridge, a place so remote that even Google Maps struggled to pinpoint it. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just me, my thoughts, and the quiet hum of nature. The drive up was uneventful. The narrow road wound through dense forests that seemed to grow darker as I climbed higher. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was sinking behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The cabin was exactly what I expected: small, weathered and charming in a rugged sort of way. The interior was basic: a tiny kitchen, a single bedroom, and a living area with a stone fireplace. A collection of dusty books lined a shelf, and a single rocking chair faced a window overlooking the forest. It was perfect. The first night was quiet. I cooked a simple meal, read one of the old books, and let the crackle of the fireplace lull me into an early sleep. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I'd spent the day hiking the nearby trails, snapping photos of the scenery and soaking in the solitude. By the time I returned, dusk had settled over the ridge. As I approached the cabin, I noticed something strange. The rocking chair by the window was moving. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the air was still, not a single leaf stirring. The chair rocked back and forth, slow and deliberate, as though someone invisible was sitting in it. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. After a long moment, I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe it had been rocking all along, and I hadn't noticed. I shook off the unease and went inside. That night, the forest was unnervingly quiet. No crickets, no owls, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against the cabin walls. I sat by the fire, trying to read, but my mind kept wandering back to the rocking chair. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. As I turned off the lights, I caught a glimpse of something outside the window, a shadow moving through the trees. I froze. It was too large to be an animal, but too fluid to be a person. The shadow moved quickly, darting from tree to tree, almost as if it was circling the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but the beam only illuminated the nearest trees. Beyond that, the forest was impenetrable. I locked the door and windows, telling myself it was just paranoia. Lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every groan of the old wood made my skin crawl. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, a faint knocking sound. It wasn't coming from the door, but from the window in the living room. The knocks were soft and rhythmic, almost like a polite request for entry. I stayed in bed, clutching the blanket like a shield, my breath shallow and rapid. The knocking continued, unrelenting. After what felt like an eternity, it stopped. Then I heard the whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, as if it was coming from just outside the bedroom window. "Let me in!" The voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was something wrong with it. It didn't sound natural, like it was imitating human speech, but hadn't quite mastered it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The whisper came again, this time from the living room. "Let me in!" I grabbed my phone, forgetting I didn't have service. The screen glowed uselessly in the darkness. Suddenly the knocking resumed, louder and more forceful, as if fists were pounding on every window at once. "Let me in." The voice was no longer soft. It was guttural, angry, and accompanied by the sound of something heavy dragging across the porch. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and bolted from the bedroom, aiming the beam wildly as I ran for the door. The cabin was empty, but the windows were covered in smeared handprints, long and claw-like, as if something had been pressing against the glass. I threw open the door and ran into the forest, not caring where I was going. The flashlight flickered, and I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate. The voice followed me, echoing through the trees. "Come back. You're not supposed to leave." I tripped over a root, falling hard to the ground. When I turned, I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the flashlight's beam, its body unnaturally thin, its face obscured by a tangle of shadows. It tilted its head, the way a predator studies its prey. "Stay," it whispered. I scrambled to my feet and ran until my lungs burned. Somehow, I found the road and followed it back to my car. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. When I told the locals about the cabin, they exchanged uneasy glances. One old man finally spoke up. "No one's rented that place in years," he said. "Not since the fire." I stared at him, confused. "Fire?" "Burned down decades ago," he said. "People say it's cursed. They hear voices, see things that aren't there. You're lucky you got out." I never went back to Blackthorn Ridge, but even now, in the dead of night, I sometimes hear it, the soft knocking at my window and the voice calling me back.